now so honored to welcome our three panelists who will help expand on these issues and action plans by sharing their valuable work and unique insight with us this evening. First, Professor Tara Roque is an assistant professor of practice and assistant director of the Interdisciplinary Environmental Clinic here at WashU. She joined the law school after 10 years of litigation experience, including work on efforts to hold a mining and smelting organization responsible for lead poisoning caused by its operations. Following graduation, she clerked for Judge Stephen N. Limbaugh Sr. of the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Missouri. She then worked as a litigation associate, handling a wide variety of complex litigation. Immediately prior to joining the law school, Tara worked for the Consumer Protection Division of the Missouri Attorney General's Office, assisting with opioid product litigations. Welcome, Tara.
Hi, how are you? So as Sammy said, I'm the assistant director of the Interdisciplinary Environmental Clinic here at WashU. My expertise is very much, I'm a lawyer and I'm a litigator, but I'm also an environmentalist at heart, and I have always held that near and dear to the work that I do. When I had the opportunity to come join the clinic and actually practice environmental law in a way that protected the community instead of harmed it, frankly, I jumped at it. And my work here at WashU has focused on largely environmental justice and coal and work fighting against coal companies in the region. I'm very happy to be here.
Great, thank you so much. As always, if there are questions directed to Tara of any of our panelists specifically, feel free to utilize the chat or Q&A function as well. Next is Madeline Middlebrooks. Madeline is an Equal Justice Works Fellow focusing on lead contamination issues in St. Louis area schools. She is originally from outside of St. Louis. Madeline attended the University of Oregon, where she earned Bachelor of Science in Environmental Studies and a minor in Geography and Nonprofit Management. In 2020, she graduated from Sturm College of Law. She returned to Great Rivers after being a summer associate in the summer of 2019. Her commitment to helping communities experiencing environmental injustices is rooted in the belief that your zip code should not determine your level of exposure to pollution or access to safe green spaces. Madeline is an Equal Justice Works Fellow sponsored by Faber Dafer. Welcome, Madeline.
Hi, Sammy. Hi, everyone else. So happy to be here. As Sammy said, I am a staff attorney and Equal Justice Works Fellow at Great Rivers Environmental Law Center here in St. Louis. We are one of St. Louis's only environmental nonprofits and law firms working on issues, but we have a large focus on working on environmental racism in the St. Louis area and also statewide. My work specifically focuses on lead contamination issues in St. Louis area schools, specifically SLPS. I'm happy to talk about just broad environmental racism themes today and also specifically focusing on lead contamination issues in schools. Thank you for having me.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Madeline. And our third panelist is Ashton Keenel. Ashton is a grassroots organizer for the Missouri Sierra Club. She grew up in the Metro East, but moved to St. Louis 6 years ago to study social work at St. Louis University. She comes to environmental justice work after studying and organizing around the need for clean air and health protections in St. Louis to negate the health impacts of the climate crisis. The Sierra Club is the oldest, most influential environmental grassroots organization in the country. From their founding in 1892, they advocate for just climate solutions, clean air, safe water, land protection, and a vibrant natural world for environmental and social justice, and getting people outdoors to enjoy nature. Welcome, Ashton.
Thanks, Sammy, for having me, and thanks for everyone else on this panel. I'm so excited to be here. Like Sammy said, my name is Ashton. I use she, her, and they, them pronouns, and I'm a grassroots organizer for the Missouri Sierra Club chapter. I'm based in St. Louis, which is the occupied land of the Osage, Miami, and Sioux people. And I'm just really grateful to be with you here today to discuss environmental and social justice issues. As someone who lives with asthma and understands the impact of pollution and the climate crisis, both personally and professionally, super excited to be here and have this dialogue with you all. And I'm really excited to especially talk about the centered work on our local action in St. Louis, because I honestly see St. Louis as a future of justly addressing the climate crisis and addressing environmental racism. But before we get started, I also wanted to take a moment and just, shed a light that a lot of injustices have been facing the Black community this week, in the past few weeks, specifically at the hands of the police. Just this week, we've had Dante Wright killed by the police, and there's a lot of harm and pain going on, specifically with repeated injustices to our Black communities, friends, and neighbors. So I just hope everyone's able to take care of themselves and their friends, as the impacts of violence and racism is hard for many. And we'll be talking about that racism in this space. So hope everyone has healing for themselves. And thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Ashton. And similarly, if at any moment you feel the need to step away from the panel, we are recording today's session. So to reiterate, Ashton, take care of yourselves, and these resources will be made available following this allotted time as well. So no worries on that. We always like to recognize that everyone attending to these discussions approaches with varying levels of background knowledge or education with the topic chosen. So I would like to begin, as I always do, by having our panelists outline their interpretations of the term environmental racism in general and the main factors at play both in St. Louis and nationally. So to begin, to all of our panelists, to include your perspectives, how do we define environmental racism, again, nationally, locally, and how might these definitions differ between these different areas? We can maybe start with Madeline.
Yeah, of course. How I define environmental racism is when communities of color are faced with higher exposure to pollutant, environmental hazards, or toxins at a higher rate than their white affluent counterparts. And also, just on the flip side of that, unequal access to clean green spaces, healthy foods, and not being a part of those conversations and policies that put those systems into place. So most people understand that, in a modern society, there are some level of pollution exposures that happen, but it's unequally being shared by communities of color, happening here in St. Louis, happening nationally, and also globally as well.
And Ashton, is there insight again about how these definitions might vary both nationally and locally?
Yeah, when I personally think of environmental racism, first, I recognize that it comes in many different forms. This can look like building oil lines through the sacred land of Indigenous people, from allowing communities to be harmed from lead poisoning or radioactive contamination, which are both very prevalent in the St. Louis area, mind you. Globally, nationally, and locally, these are just different geographic areas that we created, right? But whether it's decided by your local utility or your federal legislature or international companies, this injustice and this racism is happening. In fact, one of my colleagues put it so well. His name is Hop Hopkins, and I'll share a link to this piece that he wrote. But at the Sierra Club, we frame it a lot. Environmental racism and environmental justice around the lines a lot of, you can't have climate change and environmental injustices without sacrifice zones. And you can't have sacrifice zones without disposable people. And you can't have disposable people without racism. When we pollute the crap out of our environment, that's a way that our community leaders and entities are saying to those people that we're not invested in you. We need people to know that all people are sacred of life, and the people and all over the area call this place home. And in order to treat people kindly, we need to treat our places and resources not as disposable, but actually give life to them. So yeah, that's how we see it.
Absolutely, thank you. And Professor Roque, throughout your time at the clinic, has your perceived definition of environmental racism either changed through the initiatives or added on at all?
I can't say that it's changed. I mean, the definition of environmental racism, it's essentially the same that's of the problem at the heart of a huge problem at the root of our country. And it comes down to political power and lack thereof. So there's an acronym that you will find if you take property in law school. It's called NIMBY, not in my backyard. So there is always, like Madeline and Ashton indicated, there is some level of pollution that's going to occur for us to have a society. If you want to have electricity, until they develop and use renewables, you're going to have some level of pollution because of that. If you want to get from point A to point B in your car, there's going to be some level of pollution. If you want a bag of chips, there's going to be some level of pollution from that. It's just, where are these facilities being located, and where is the waste being put, and where are investments being made? And time after time, the answer is that investments are being made in wealthy white communities, and the pollution, the cost of those investments, the cost of our electricity, the cost of our bag of chips is being put in neighborhoods that don't have the power to go to their representatives and say, not in my backyard. No, that trash transfer station is not going in my backyard. No, that highway is not going in my backyard. Put it somewhere else. So they do, they put it in somewhere else, and that somewhere else is in the backyards of people of color and people living in poverty. And that is itself at the root of environmental racism. And whether you look at it on a local, national, or international scale, it's the same. When we put our plastics in recycling, well, that doesn't actually get recycled in the US. Most likely it gets shipped over to some poor country overseas where all of our junk gets piled up there. It doesn't get piled up in our backyard, it's in theirs. When they put a trash transfer station, recently they were trying to put a trash transfer station in the center of Dutchtown in South St. Louis. Not a white community. They would not put that in the middle of a white community. No one would ever think about it. So whether you're looking at it in national, international, or locally, it's always the same. It's just not in my backyard.
Absolutely. And from that, it seems to be a lot of identified factors that would contribute to it. Our next question has to do with that directly, the methodologies of identifying instances or abuses of environmental racism. Madeline, we've heard sort of financial investments or financial redirection away from communities of color, maybe political representation. Sort of how do we weigh between these different instances that might contribute to actions of environmental racism?
Yeah, a great tool just to first see if environmental racism is occurring is actually a free tool that the EPA puts out called EJ Screen or ECHO. And you can map how many polluting facilities are in a certain area and then overlay it with census data to see the percentage of minority owned or minority occupied in that certain area. So that's one great way just to see visually. So if you map the north side, you'll see more air polluting facilities on the north side versus other areas around St. Louis, especially in St. Louis County. In terms of following the money to see where divestments and investments are occurring, if you just look around to see where are the new shopping centers going in, where do people actually want to move, where do people feel safe, and where are people having access to parks. So you really can see this visually where this is occurring. Where is the hyper vacancy issues in our cities? Where aren't they reinvesting to bring some neighborhoods back? And I'm not talking about gentrification, I'm talking about the responsible way of bringing certain communities back, and where are we putting in time to invest and not just putting an expensive apartment complex that then pushes people out, right? So if you can really visually see environmental racism, and that's kind of what inspired me to get into this field, because I saw a documentary and how apparent it really can be. I mean, if you just drive the 70 corridor going north, from downtown St. Louis to St. Charles County, even, you can see right there the differences of how those two communities live and how close they are in terms of investments, where the facilities are, and also access to green spaces. I don't know if that answered your question, Sammy, I'm sorry.
No, absolutely, yeah. And to build off of that, Ashton, can you speak a little bit about the efforts of the Sierra Club perhaps to engage community perspective or community awareness of these infractions on environmental justice within their communities to help similarly identify when these instances have occurred?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. As a community organizer for the Sierra Club, my role is to listen to community members to truly understand what's going on in their community and their environment. So even in terms of our environmental racism report that Sierra Club was a part of, along with some other community partners who I will introduce here shortly. We first and foremost started with listening to our neighbors and those most impacted. What were they and their families experiencing in their neighborhoods? What's going on in your community? What's concerning you? And what change would you like to see? Those were some of the questions we were asking many folks all across the city, and particularly in the neighborhoods and the wards most impacted by environmental issues. But by listening to community members, their thoughts and experiences from the issues they were seeing, from vacant buildings, illegal dumping, high asthma rates, we were able to, one, truly understand what they were going through and can empathize with their story, right? And then two, work and build community with them, work and build community power with each other through mutual understanding and trust. We understand that their issues are being so worsened due to their location and who they are because of different norms, which I'll touch on later also, in different systems we have in place here in our city. But being able to share our stories and how we are connected through these same injustices is very crucial. But with the Sierra Club, we joined in partnership with Action St. Louis, Arch City Defenders, Dutchtown South Community Corporation, the Washington University Environmental Interdisciplinary Law Clinic. And we took these stories from the folks we were talking to and we're able to turn that into data and really look at these and see where repeating instances of environmental injustices and racism were occurring. And so with that, we were able to take these conversations and turn them into data, which I will be sharing here into the chat. But definitely it starts with knowing your community, knowing what's going on, what's most mattering with the folks, and connecting that into a shared vision for an area.
Absolutely. And I think awareness or knowing what's happening, as you mentioned, comes a lot from information with legislation being pushed and at the policy level as well. And I'd love to turn to audience submitted question for Professor Roque from Jacqueline. She asks, how has recent legislation either supported or interfered with efforts to promote environmental justice and challenge environmental racism?
I guess it depends on how recent you're talking about. There was a recent slight change in the focus that our government was taking when it comes to issues of environmentalism, you know, whether we want our country to be protected from toxins or not, whether we want to have policies that prioritize and protect people of color or not. And there was a bit of a sea change, I would say, in the way that the government speaks about these issues. I must say, I rather enjoy the way they're talking about it now more than they were talking about it before. We are only a few months into the current administration, so I can't say that there has been action yet, but I don't find that dispiriting because we are just a few months into their administration. There have been a few promises made that I am very hopeful for. For one, Biden has promised that 40% of the nationwide spending on climate readiness is to be allocated to communities of color and those communities most harmed by environmental injustices. That is something that needs to happen, because often when money gets put out there by the government to address issues, it gets snatched up by the companies and who are most able to apply, who have the wherewithal to apply for these grants and opportunities quickly and properly They have lawyers, they pay for them, they get them faster than the communities that often need them. So I find that a really great thing. Our representative, Cori Bush, proposed a great bill called, it's a mouthful, the Environmental Justice Mapping and Data Collection Act of 2021. That act was at least partially spurned by the report that the clinic put out with Sierra Club Action, Arch, and Dutchtown South. So I'm particularly proud of that one, which seeks to do with this data-based analysis that Ashton talked about, but take it on a nationwide scale, figure out what is going on, who is getting harmed, what extent are they getting harmed, how are they getting harmed, and then allocate those 40%, the 40% of dollars, use a targeted allocation so that the funds go and actually address those issues in those specific communities. So I really like that, because while environmental injustice is a nationwide problem, it is a local nationwide problem in that it varies locality by locality, community by community, and it's not something that can be addressed with one single catch-all solution. There needs to be targeted solutions for each of these targeted problems. But still, the same challenges still remain. No matter who is in government, no matter what's happening, you still have that same, it still goes back to that NIMBYism concept. Those in power, those with money, have the ears of our politicians, they donate to our politicians, and frankly, they help write the laws that end up getting passed. And they ensure that their personal wealth is protected. They ensure that industry is able to operate cheaply through low levels of regulation. That ensures that more toxins continue to get put out there in the environment and continue to harm those that don't have the political power. So am I hopeful? Yes. Do I think we've reached the panacea where we have nothing else to worry about? Absolutely not.
Absolutely. And that segues great into sort of the next question, which is, what's missing? I think, Madeline, with your background in law as well, and currently working as a fellow at your firm, what have you identified as like inherently missing from sort of the direction the policies are taking, either as was posed in, I think, a separate question submitted before the panel started, is money enough to sort of redirect those efforts and make that change, or what might be missing from the current language of the legislation that you've identified as important to include in the future?
Money going to the right causes is a great first start. And another great change would be really, as Ashton was saying, engaging community members and listening to their stories, and also bringing information to community members and say that I'm presenting this information, I'm not running any kind of agenda. I just want you to have this information. So specifically in my work, I work on lead contamination issues in St. Louis area schools and just schools in general. And when I talk to a lot of folks, they just assume that schools are regulated for lead, because how could they not, is kind of the thought process there. And I remember before I went to law school, I naively thought too, like, laws are here to protect us. They're equally applied. Of course, we have great laws that protect the environment. Of course, if someone pollutes, then they go to court and they get sued, and then quickly it gets remedied. And I quickly learned pretty early on in law school, that's not how it works. And if we don't fight for certain laws and advocate for stricter standards and say that we deserve more, and we might be a community of color, low income community of color, but we deserve to be here and we deserve to have this access. So I think also just getting the word out there that we can ask for more of our government, we can ask for stricter laws, we can ask for more protection. Like I said before, money is always a great first step. I know money is a big part of my project, making sure I have the funding, right, to effectuate the change I would like to see at the state legislature or at the local level. And last, you can't do anything without a community behind you at the forefront of the movement. It is my belief that any successful environmental justice battle that has been won has been community-led and community-focused. And without that, it's not sustainable, because the attorney leaves, or whoever comes in, the consultant leaves, and then another issue will pop back up. Okay, well, they've organized around this issue. Maybe it's a landfill, right? Okay, well, the landfill is done with. Well, what are we doing over here on the side? And if the community doesn't have those tools, that's that internal building, that internal sustainability, it'll just be hit with another EJ issue. So I really truly believe the community has to be front and center and motivated to move the ball forward.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting point that while policy or those sort of like financial redistributions might be less inherently stable as maybe different like officials come in and out of office or different plans are pushed given different priorities, focusing on community engagement might be more stable long-term or more reliable to have. Similarly, in the Q&A, it was brought up that St. Louis City just elected a new mayor, Tashara Jones, and to that vein, I think it's clear that as officials are changing or plans are being implemented, that relying on the community-based partnerships is crucial. Similarly, Malcolm in the Q&A, Ashton is wondering what are some of the ways to stay up to date with policy proposals in local legislature and how to advocate for them at the grassroots level, which the Sierra Club I know has a lot of experience doing.
Oh, yes. I love this question. I'm so excited. Yeah, to get engaged with what's going on. First and foremost, there's so much going on at all points in terms of legislation in Jefferson City or even in Washington, D.C., and sometimes even in St. Louis City or county government, right? So it's really helpful to team up with other folks who know what the heck is going on and who can have time and capacity to track what's going on, right? So there's a lot of great organizations that do that kind of work for so many different kind of fields. The Sierra Club, we track legislation at all levels of government and use our power and our resources, right, to tell people what's going on and give them opportunities to take action. So we are often doing action alerts or via email or phone call or text message to our members, to our constituents saying, hey, this bill was just introduced and it's going to take away your community's right to move towards 100% clean, renewable future, which is something we see about 5 times every year, honestly, from different bills sponsored by many different corporate polluters or whoever else. So partnering up with organizations is a great way to take action. Many organizations will have fact sheets about what's going on, can even do a step-by-step process of how to take action. I am often submitting testimony to Jefferson City House committees or Senate committees for different issues, and it's a really great way to plug in to find out how you can get involved and put your voice on the record, because that is very influential. And also just getting to know your elected officials is once again very, very influential. Because we're able to humanize our issues and our purpose, and knowing that your vote is one of the most crucial things to our elected officials, it can carry a lot of weight. So building your relationships and getting linked up with some organizations to take action is really great way to do action, I guess.
Absolutely. And Tara, I'd love to pose a similar question to you from your experience at the clinic, and Madeline as well, sort of the most effective means of enacting change, sort of maybe not perhaps completely at the individual level yet, but the ways in which your respective organizations or efforts have either planned initiatives, gone about structuring them to ensure that they are relevant, effective, and successful. We'd love to hear some experience with that.
Well, how the clinic operates is a little bit different than that, in that so while we're part of the law school, we're also a law firm. Madeline works there are only 2 environmental law firms in the entire state. Madeline works for one, and the second is out of WashU, staffed by students. So we need a lot more environmental lawyers in this state. But aside from that, the work that we do is we get hired by clients to address a problem that they have. So we don't go out there like the Sierra Club does and just say, this is a problem, we are going to solve it. People come to us and say, I have a problem, can you help me solve it? And we solve it in a whole host of ways, whether it's by suing someone that is causing the pollution, or whether it is by addressing vacancy issues in the courts, going after derelict owners of houses, house by house. So sometimes it's through the courts. Sometimes we do it through regulation. The state and federal level, people put out a whole host of good regulation and a whole host of bad regulation. When it's good, we tell them it's good. When it's bad, we tell them it's bad, and we point out all the ways that those regulations are in violation of the law. And we hope that those agencies at times will see the light and say, you know what, maybe we should follow the law this time and draft a regulation that actually follows the statute that we're implementing. And the last way we do is policy. And the environmental racism report was one of our sort of actions at policy. And that one was more focused, our environmental racism work is multifaceted. The first stage was education. So the environmental racism report was education. It's like all these people that think they have problems, but maybe it's just them and maybe they've been gaslit a little bit. No, it's not just you. You are being subject to a whole host of environmental disparities, and it's happening to you because you're poor and you're Black. And that's why it's happening. You're not crazy. This is happening to you. It's real, it's disparate, and it's wrong. So the first step was through education. And now we're looking at ways, how can we change this? How should the laws be written so that this cannot occur? And knowing that it already has occurred, what should happen policy-wise? What changes should be made to the law in order to remedy all the harms that the public sphere has done to communities of color in St. Louis and frankly nationwide and worldwide? But we're just looking at St. Louis because that worldwide is a little bit much for a little clinic in the basement of the WashU Law School. But so that's how we do it. When someone comes to us with a problem, if we have the capacity, we try to help them.
And Madeline and Ashton, perhaps framing this question about previous successful initiatives or actions, we can also get into the very interesting specifics of both your works in lead contamination and clean air in particular. Is there maybe a little bit of background of why those particular instances of environmental injustice stood out to you, and sort of what effective initiatives have been in place to mitigate those particular concerns from each of your perspectives?
Yeah, I can start. So for me, like Sammy said, I focus mostly on lead contamination issues, specifically in schools. And for me, I decided to start my legal career. So I started as an attorney at Great Rivers back in September. And I decided to focus a 2-year fellowship on lead contamination issues because I just couldn't get past the idea of children being exposed to lead at school. And so it's just a really personal connection. I was like called to work on this issue. And so I was fortunate enough to apply for a fellowship that allowed me to spend 2 years working on this issue. So it's a little bit different than a typical staff attorney who, when clients come in, you kind of work on what your clients want you to work on. And so for me, I'm more of a policy, specifically focused on this lead contamination issue. And the reason why I picked schools is because children can spend up to 6 to 8 hours at school. And there is not a federal mandate currently. The lead and copper rule, which is the rule that governs the contaminants in our water in terms of lead, is under revision currently. But as current right now, there's no federal or state mandate that requires testing in schools. And if you don't test, you would not know lead was in the water. And because it's a clear, odorless substance. And actually, if you heat up lead, like other contaminants that might dissolve the contaminant, it actually increases the lead concentration. So it's just a really terrible contaminant that has lifelong effects if children especially are exposed to it. And so for me, I thought if I had the chance to work on this really sad public health crisis, I should at least try. And luckily enough, I was funded by my funder to work on this issue for the next 2 years. And so I think, I mean, there's so many different types of environmental racism issues, but really any older city in the Midwest with any kind of construction built prior before 1978 is facing some kind of lead crisis. And unfortunately, even outside of the schools, I know in the environmental racism report, they reported that, correct me if I'm wrong, one of you too, that Black children are 2.4 times more likely to have elevated lead levels in the city of St. Louis than white children. And I also at this point just want to highlight, I know that all of us have codified it with poor Black children or poor Black people, but in general, race is the leading indicator if you're going to experience environmental racism. So it's not always just if you're Black, you're have a higher chance of experiencing environmental racism. I always just like to put that caveat out there. So that's just why I picked lead poisoning, specifically in schools. There are so many issues you could work on, but lead is a pretty widespread issue in our city and a lot of other Midwestern cities.
And Ashton, you focused on clean air and pollution, I believe, when we were discussing all of the awesome work coming out of the Sierra Club.
Yeah, I am very honored to be able to work and really put a lot of my energy towards the crisis we're focusing in terms of our air quality and just how we can be more sustainable with our energy use and how that impacts our health as well. Everything is intersectional, right? But I come to this work from personally having asthma. I grew up just across the Mississippi River and in Missouri, and even right across the river in the western part of Illinois, southwestern part. There's just infrastructure after infrastructure, polluting infrastructure with so much emissions going into our air and our water. And specifically growing up at the intersection of in Grafton, Illinois, at the intersection of the Illinois River and the Mississippi River. And then just seeing right across the river over in Missouri, I believe it's the Sioux power plant blowing emissions right into our neighborhoods. And that deeply impacted me. It impacts many people from my community with elevated asthma rates, elevated rates of cancer, and really rare cancers also. And then when I moved to St. Louis to go into a field of social work, I knew I wanted to tackle some form of social injustice. Being able to relate my own experience of injustices based on just where I've lived and what infrastructure they decided to put near my community was just as bad and especially worse in the city. And it was to no community's fault of their own other than where they lived and redlining and how resources and investments were happening. So I was really moved by the fact that as someone who was attending St. Louis University, if I just traveled several blocks north on the other side of Del Mar, there are children, Black children with higher rates of asthma than me, and that's just because of based off where they lived and what was going on in their environment. And that just really touched me, and I knew that's what I wanted to focus on more as I grew and developed as an organizer. And so that's what brings me into this work, and I'm excited to be able to address a lot of those injustices through my work at the Sierra Club as we're having community conversations about what's going on, how we're holding public utilities accountable, how we're mobilizing voters to vote for environmental champions, a lot of different work just to hopefully one day solve the air pollution crisis we have.
Thank you both for sharing that. And I think it's important to reiterate how environmental racism is uniquely a public health crisis as well. And I think in that vein, there's a great question in the Q&A from Malcolm. Perhaps I can pose it to Tara to start. He asks, how can medical professionals or students address the policy side of environmental justice? And I'm wondering if there's any collaboration across schools with the Med Campus or medical professionals in ways that those voices or perspectives could be utilized to aid with policy change or advocacy at all.
Well, frankly, there are so many ways. Well, first, I mean, Malcolm, should I assume you're in med school? Is that correct? But I'll just take that as a yes since I can't see you. But so I know I have given a talk to first-year med students on issues of environmental injustices, just so that they are aware of them, because frankly, for the most part, people who are able to afford to get all the way through medical school likely come from privileged backgrounds and often do not know about these things because they don't live in communities where they see them on a daily basis. Because environmental justice is our country is segregated. You're either in a clean area or you're not, and the clean areas more often than not are majority white, and that's a fact of life in this country. Is it right? No. Is it terrible? Yes, but it's a fact of life in this country. Now, if you don't know about these issues and you don't know how to look out for them when treating your patients. So particularly incoming physicians, new physicians need to learn about this, need to know about what harms their communities are facing. So when they see certain behaviors, when they see certain symptoms in children, in families, and this and that, well, they could say, oh, this person lives in the city of St. Louis. Well, I know that this area of St. Louis has a huge problem they have terrible landlord-tenant laws, and there's a huge issue with mold in this city. You're having respiratory distress. Can you check to see if you have mold in your house? This area has really high lead levels. When's the last time you got tested? Let's test you again and make sure you're okay, even though you're not showing symptoms yet, because I know this is a big issue in your neighborhood. So just knowing the issues that your patients face can help you better diagnose illnesses early on, where people can remedy, hopefully, the environmental issue that's causing them, or at least treat the harm in the child or in the family member. So yes, that's important to inform. So I didn't answer your question exactly. That's not the policy side, that's the education side. For the policy side, yes, push for policies that help people. Medicaid expansion. Oh my goodness, if people had access to primary care physicians to diagnose these issues when they are occurring, regularly seeing the same physician instead of seeing this ER doc and that ER doc, where there would be a continuity of care to diagnose these issues, health rates would increase dramatically and health costs would decrease because people aren't using the ER as their primary care physician. Other policy issues, asthma treatment, better asthma treatment and asthma follow-up for children to make sure that they have continuity of care, that there is follow-up, that they have access to an inhaler, that they can afford an inhaler, the inhaler is provided for them if they cannot, and that someone, if there's a consistent problem with a family, maybe have a housing inspector go out and see if there's a problem in the home that needs to be taken care of. Same with lead. Yes, we need to have a lead inspections of all public housing, of all landlord housing. We need lead testing in North St. Louis in the soil. All the schools' waters need to be tested. Actually, all the water needs to be tested. We need to know what's in our pipes, what's in our soil, what's in our paint. And you know what? The city should fund it and the city should fix it. Because while it's an expense now in the short term, do you know how much money we would save long term by not mentally damaging our children from here until the end of eternity? A lot. And that's just looking at the financial issue, setting aside the moral ones, which is obvious. Sorry, I get a little excited about this because it makes me angry. So yes, push for all of these policies. Vote. Let people know that you vote and let people know why you vote, so that the politicians who want your vote know that they need to talk about this And then after they're elected, contact them and said, hey, you talked about this. I don't see you doing anything. If you want my vote in 2 years again, you better start. So they know that not only do they have to talk about it, they have to do something about it. So yes, there's tons and tons and tons that people can do.
Absolutely, and I love that that extends also beyond a medical, background as well. There's so many different approaches to be involved as well. But I think that was a great question. I'd love to circle back to something that was mentioned. I think most specifically by Madeline, but it's definitely been addressed in how intersectional of an issue environmental racism is, and to sort of question or expand on the associating risk factors involved in identifying either communities or situations most susceptible to injustices as well. We mentioned it's predominantly race. It's not just race, it's socioeconomic status, it's housing, unemployment status as well. Madeline, are there additional sort of associative intersectional factors that are important to recognize?
Those are the biggest ones, but also sometimes it gets wrapped up in poverty, but sometimes really rural communities, especially with issues like sewer, are being affected out there in rural places. And while there might be, sometimes poverty doesn't always necessarily cover rural areas. So sometimes there is money out in for whatever reason. So some rural areas also experience different EJ issues because of where they're located. And that's sometimes why I like to separate environmental racism and just environmental injustices, because obviously that necessarily wouldn't be an environmental racism issue if it's like a white affluent person out in the country. But that's still, because of where they're located, they kind of can be targeted for certain issues such as sewer and other issues like that. But like how the other panelists echoed, any community that people think are disposable, whatever that reason might be in your community. So maybe it's this community because English is not their first language, right? So if we post something, it doesn't necessarily mean that race or socioeconomic status necessarily, it probably does intersect, right? But maybe it doesn't. Still, like where the flyers being posted about different sites coming into community or how you're getting your news, it might not be covered. So it might be easier for a polling facility to set up shop in an area where English is not the first language, or I'm also thinking of maybe access to like internet. But most of those issues are connected with race or socioeconomic status. So that's why those are the leading causes, leading identifiers of environmental racism.
And when the issue becomes a lot more intersectional, it sort of requires that community partnership, I'm sure, to expand. Ashton, sort of some organization that just comes to mind, NARAL, Missouri, does a lot of work with reproductive justice as well as, maternal health, the health of pregnant people. And I'm wondering, just sort of even personally, are there collaborations that the Sierra Club has with maybe less like traditionally environmentally focused groups where that overlap would still take place?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to apologize right now because I'm getting some notifications that my Wi-Fi is a little unstable. So if I am cutting out, please let me know. But yeah, the Sierra Club, I'm very blessed to be in the Sierra Club and my role specifically because I do get to work a lot with our coalition members and many different coalition members for various different reasons. Like the Sierra Club back in 2019 and 2020, we worked with NARAL, Pro-Choice, Missouri Job with Justice, Planned Parenthood, Missouri Faith Voices, Metropolitan Congregation United, Action St. Louis, Organization for Black Struggle. So, labor, faith, identity, Black empowerment focused groups, we all came together to gather signatures for Medicaid expansion. So I'm really happy you mentioned that, Tara, because Medicaid expansion is true to my heart after running that campaign. And then after that, talking to voters to vote for it. And we did that because, like Tara mentioned, we see this as the health issue as an intersectional issue. And if those most impacted by the climate crisis, like we know they're going to have intense or just awful health impacts from air pollution, from flooding, from so many issues, they need to have health care. So to be able to bring that message to a wide variety of folks through our coalitions have been very, very empowering. And also, I'm really excited to continue the work of this as well, and especially as we're stepping into, what our city and state looks like based off of the effects of COVID-19. Also, be learning more and stepping more into how can we ensure we're being just to our folks who are losing their house or becoming unhoused during this time too, because that's an environmental issue as well. So yeah, I'll pause there.
Absolutely. And to understand sort of the exchange of ideas between communities likely eventually means that those ideas are then disseminated to the general public to be additionally informed. I know we sort of covered the policy aspect in particular, but to focus on public education, either efforts or incentives, is that maybe for Tara specifically, what have you found to be instances of public health education surrounding issues of environmental racism that are perhaps effective to get community recognition or support? Is that done like within schools? Is that sort of like more wide scale? Or how does public education sort of play a role? Or is it not where it needs to be yet, as an additional question?
It's not where it needs to be. Well, I guess it depends on where you're looking. Where is the education coming from? Is the city of St. Louis, state of Missouri, and the United States of America doing enough to educate people of the dangers that they face in their own communities, to look at chipping paint on their wall and say, is that lead paint or is it latex paint? Do I need to worry about it? To know what's in their water. Should they be drinking their water or not? What is the source of their asthma? Is there a problem with their air? Do they need HEPA filters in their home? There are no real education campaigns out there, at least not that I have been made aware of, certainly not in our region, from the public sector to let people know what dangers they are likely encountering on a day-to-day basis and how to protect themselves from it. So no, it's not there. The nonprofit sector has done for quite some time its best to fill that gap. Whether now COVID has put a real big dampener on that because it's all in person, it's community events, it's religious, it's going into churches and temples and community organizations and rec centers and schools and just showing up and saying, here's a flyer with some information, please don't throw it out, read it. And it's telling people, it's giving talks, it's handing out free coffee and donuts to get people to listen to you so they learn about this. It's those sort of information campaigns. And then once people learn about it, they are so happy to know about it so they know how to protect themselves and their families. But our government's not doing that. It's the nonprofit that's filling that role. And nonprofits can never reach the same audience, the same level of audience as the government could. The government should be doing this. All of, the kind of campaigns they did, those anti-smoking campaigns, they should be doing those sorts of campaigns for environmental toxins. But for whatever reason, it's not a current priority. It should be, but it's not. So, I mean, one example, it's not an issue. Well, frankly, it is an issue, environmental racism, going back to COVID. So if you all know, there was this huge magical vaccine desert in St. Louis. Somehow all the vaccines were getting sent to the center of the state, and the population centers were not given vaccine events. Finally, they did a vaccine event in North St. Louis, which was a good thing. Great. Put a bunch of vaccines in the community that is suffering and dying from COVID at rates higher than anywhere else in our region. Yes, good idea. Please do that. But there was no information campaign. I get an email from someone, hey, there's COVID vaccines in North St. Louis, not enough people signed up. So, hey, you white lady who works at WashU, do you need a vaccine? You can go in. You don't even need to have a number of your priority. It doesn't matter if we're at your tier yet. There are extras. You can go take it. No, That shouldn't be mine. There should have been information campaigns to tell these communities that these vaccines are available, but it didn't happen. So a whole bunch of rich white folks flooded North St. Louis, probably for the first and last time in their lives, to get a vaccine. There needs to be public information to communities, not just to the Central West End, not just to WashU, but to all of St. Louis, so that we can all benefit from these services, but it's just not happening.
And similarly, is that in thinking about what would be most effective, because it seems like it's not a radical or new idea to push our representatives or push our policymakers to consider these kinds of inherent obstacles as well. Is there room for sort of student action or student involvement to that effect? Is social media an effective tool at all? Is sort of what are methods that perhaps students in our audience could participate in mitigating those kinds of impacts?
Well, social media only works if your reach is to the communities that are affected. If your followers are a bunch of other students at WashU, is that going to do anything? Frankly, no. Is it a good thing to put the word out there? Yes, it doesn't hurt. It only takes a second, do it. But is that going to have a significant impact if you don't have, followers or whatever the terms are? I'm old. Whatever the terms are, if you don't have followers that are in these affected communities, posting something on Twitter isn't going to make a difference. What would make a difference is taking a drive out to communities, knocking on doors, handing out flyers, going to community events, all these things that I can't suggest that you do. I didn't suggest that. We're in COVID. You're not allowed to do that. WashU students, I did not just say that. But all of these things that's how you have to actually get out there. You have to get off your butt, put your computer down, put your phone down, meet people, talk to people. And when there's information that needs to be sharing, do it. Yes, you can. But really what needs to happen is there are so many organizations that are out there and already doing this work. These organizations have the connections within the community. They know how to get the word out to the community more than I do. And so when I know that I have information that I want to share with residents of North St. Louis, I don't just go out there as little Miss WashU doing it. I reach out to my partners that actually live and work in those communities and say, hey, this is something that I would like to do. Can you tell me the best way to reach this community? And can you tell me, is this something that would be wanted at first? Is this something that would be wanted and needed? If the answer is yes, then how can I best make this happen? Please, if you have time, can you help me help this community?
Mm-hmm.
But always first ask if this is something that's wanted, ask if this is something that's needed, and then ask people who have experience. And then if you're not in a place to actually share information, volunteer, donate. These are all things that can be done, but there are groups on the ground that are doing that work. And the best way to help is to work through those groups.
Absolutely. And to any of our panelists, I believe Ashton shared some as well. These organizations in particular that could be starting points for students as well to work within, again, as the needs and wants are identified by them in particular. I'm sure students would love to participate to whatever extent that would be uniquely helpful and impactful as well. And something we as Impact always try to do is disseminate those resources after our panel discussions as well to encourage that follow-up. Similarly with that, Madeline, there was a question from Cheyenne in the Q&A asking about the specific solutions that were implemented within school districts to address the lead contamination specifically. And I'm wondering if associating with that, there was any sort of public health education either to the school district itself or surrounding communities to make people aware of the issue, or whether it was addressed to the extent that was necessary in your opinion, or sort of how that situation plays out.
Yeah, so in terms of St. Louis area schools, it's still an ongoing issue. So we're just at the initial education period, reaching out to community members, trying to organize around this issue, hopefully trying to pass a policy or even at the local level or state level, some effective changes, excuse me. And so in other places across the country, at the state level, for instance, Michigan requires now at the state level that all fountains need to be tested in schools, and they have set an action level of where if lead exceeds this action level, some corrective step needs to happen. And they've also now, and I think it'll be 2023, but I'm not sure about the exact date, will require all fountains to have point of use filters on them. And so that was one of the solutions in Flint, Michigan. With the Flint, Michigan water crisis, point of use filters were used to remediate some of the homes there with higher levels of lead. But no, currently in St. Louis, this is still an ongoing issue. I have received records requests from the district itself. As recent as 2020, I've seen elevated levels of lead. And it's always important to note that there are no level of lead exposure that is safe. But since there is not a federal mandate, states and school districts have adopted their own action levels of where they would take an action. And so St. Louis Public Schools specifically selected 10 parts per billion as their action level. And there are tests in 2019 and 2020 that have elevated lead levels over their own action level of 10 parts per billion. So there are solutions that are out there to this issue that other states and other school districts have passed. St. Louis is still working on this issue, and a lot of it is public education first, and seeing, like the professor said, does the community want this? Does the community need this? And is there enough education about the issue? And so, like I was saying previously, when I give community presentations, there's a lot of, well, one, we thought this issue was solved back in 2016 when KSCK and St. Louis Post-Dispatch first reported on this issue. It's now been 5 years. Why hasn't it been solved? Or two, what do you mean schools aren't required to test their water for lead? Most people know that lead is bad. And you might not be they might not know the extent of how bad lead poisoning or elevated lead levels can be, but everyone generally knows that lead is not a safe toxin to consume. So it's there's a huge community education push going on right now with my work.
That's great to know that it's still ongoing, sort of despite any challenges associated with the pandemic, perhaps. And Annie in our Q&A was wondering, maybe Ashton, you can speak on this as well, sort of how COVID has affected the impact of environmental racism and injustice. And Professor Roque, too, if you have any insight into that as well.
Ashton, do you want to go first or me?
Yeah, I can go. I was actually like typing as you were asking that, Sammy. Finally figuring out how to utilize the Q&A function of Zoom. So grateful. But yeah, COVID has definitely impacted environmental racism and injustice. I mean, right now we're seeing folks, we're being forced to stay home in many instances, right? And particularly some of our homes are not safe to be in St. Louis. There's mold, there's lead paint, there is many other issues with illegal dumping going on in your neighborhood while your kids are home all day, or yeah, just so many issues that's going on, and they're being amplified because we're not able to always leave those environments right now. And specifically, folks are not able to really prioritize environmental injustices and environmental racism right now, when we're just worrying about our next paycheck, how we're going to feed our food, how we're going to keep a roof over our head, because people are, like I mentioned earlier, losing their houses repeatedly, and not repeatedly, I'm sorry, but that's happening very much right now. So that's definitely impacting it. And then in terms of just outreach also, and talking about this with folks, we can't really have those conversations to mobilize and just connect with folks about this issue either, because we are, again, supposed to be staying from a distance from each other. So there's a lot of instances that's impacting this. And frankly, right now, the Sierra Club, we've been working with some of our community partners to specifically pass the Thrive Agenda, which is a national piece of legislation, which is pretty similar to the Green New Deal, but builds off of that and wraps more equity into the policies of it and encompasses the need and the aid our communities need post this COVID era that we're living in, right? So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And COVID-19 has not made it easier in the slightest, but definitely has shown a spotlight to the issues we are facing and our communities are facing.
And just to add on, I mean, COVID is itself an example of environmental injustice. It's been a little while since I've checked the demographic data for COVID deaths, but last I checked, I believe that Black St. Louis City residents were dying at a rate about 60% higher than white St. Louis residents of COVID. And that stems from a number of issues. Well, frankly, and this is conjecture because we're too early in the pandemic for us to have actually, well, it's too soon for us to have actually fully unpacked why all of this is occurring. But frankly, I think it's pretty obvious. One, Black people are statistically less likely to have access to regular medical care. Two, Black people are statistically more likely to be the essential workers who haven't been able to work from home, but instead have been out there and exposed to infection rates at high, just exposed to more people than those of us that are lucky enough to work and school from home. Three, Black people have been suffering from this environment, the effects of environmental racism for decades. So their bodies are less healthy from having less access to healthy food, from having less access to quality, to clean air, from having less access to quality green spaces, to have higher lead exposure rates, more asthma, more everything. So bodies are less healthy. Put a respiratory illness in a body that's less healthy, the ultimate result is going to be not as good. So you have all of these factors coming together and compounding each other. So COVID is an environmental justice catastrophe. And it's just, frankly, one of many. And there's going to be more if we don't change this. So yes, there is an incredible correlation. And then adding, I mean, seconding what Ashton said about where are you spending that time at home? Is it a safe home or not? It's, yes, COVID mixed with environmental injustice has been terrible.
Absolutely. And this is something that seems to come up throughout a lot of our discussions because Impact was, founded during COVID last summer, very early on. So each conversation we've had has addressed the implications of the pandemic and continuing the work. And less and less we phrase it as like, well, once it's back to normal or once after the pandemic's over kind of discussion. And now it's, what will we take with us? What have we learned so far that will get us through, the rest of the pandemic as it continues, its effects continue for years and years. I do want to pose to the panelists before we give the opportunity to address some calls to action for our audience as we conclude, as to sort of where this issue might stand a couple years from now. So we tend to pose these questions during our discussions to address both what you all might be hopeful for, but what also has been perhaps missing from the conversation that you hope will be addressed either soon or at least within the next couple years. So sort of long-term, what might you be hopeful for surrounding either initiatives you're a part of or opportunities of you can address for our audience, or what hasn't been prioritized or hasn't been focused on thus far that you would like to see been given a similar attention. Maybe Madeline, we can start with you.
Yeah, I'm really hopeful that I feel like in the past especially last summer after what I call America's 100th racial awakening, that environmental racism is now I don't want to say a hot ticketed item, but it's become very popular at larger environmental law firms, smaller environmental law firms, and it's really now front and center of the environmental movement, and it hasn't historically been there. When it first started, it wasn't even a part of the environmental space. It was kind of its own separate movement. And I'm excited that it's finally getting the attention that it deserves. And I'm really hoping with that, though, that they also diversify this movement and bringing in more women of color into this space who have been doing this work. Because they've had success with it before it became popular, right? So really putting it, now that it's popular, now that we have the funding behind it, let's make sure we put it in the hands of the women of color who have already been organizing, who've already been bringing justice to their community. So that's what I'm really excited for moving forward. And I hope this energy, for lack of better words, continues. What I'm sad about moving forward is that I know environmental justice is a really long-term project. This is not something that can be fixed overnight since it's so intersectional. So as Ashton said, the climate crisis will not be addressed without environmental racism being addressed. And there's a lot of other issues similar to that need to be addressed as well. So I'm saddened that it's not going to be a quick fix, but I'm excited that a lot of people are now focusing on this really important public health and racial justice issue.
Tara, would you like to go next? Oh, I think you're still muted.
Muted. I knew I was going to do that at some point. Frankly, I really would like to mirror Madeline's comments, because environmental justice, it's what to use an overused phrase, it's a marathon, not a sprint. And I am hopeful that the focus on environmental injustice is a long-term sea change in how environmentalists view this and how politicians view this as an issue, as opposed to a trend that someone talked about it and a bunch of other people talked about it, and then people are going to forget about it once they move on to the new hot issue to talk about. I'm hoping that's not going to happen. I'm taking a wait and see approach to that because I've been burnt by hope before. Because so much does need to happen. I mean, in our region, I would say the biggest thing that needs to change in order for us to make significant progress towards justice is a complete rewriting of the landlord and tenant laws. Because right now, people live in unsafe housing and they can't do anything about it. They have lead, they have mold, they have moisture. Their houses aren't energy efficient. So they're breathing in junk, they're churning out air pollution, they don't have access to quality foods. So we really need to have significant changes in the landlord-tenant laws in our region so tenants have the right and the power to advocate for their own health in the apartments that they pay for, instead of risking their livelihood, their credit, and a court case just for advocating for the health and safety for themselves and their family. So that's a long-term change that needs to happen. Is it one that I'm hopeful for? Frankly, not particularly, but I'm still going to fight for it and try. We need to make short-term changes. We have only 3 or 4 functioning air monitors in the entire city of St. Louis, even though we don't pass for ozone rates. So, and even though we are ringed by 4 coal-fired power plants, and even though we have particulate matter coming out the wazoo, there are only 4 functioning monitors in the entire city, 2 of which are across the highway from each other. That is not enough for us to know what's going on in our city, to know what is going on in our air, what are we breathing, what toxins are we breathing, and what do we need to fix. That's a short-term solution that needs to happen. I mean, there are lots of long-term things we need to do. There's lots of short-term things to do, but what we need to really do is keep this all in the forefront of our mind, not forget about it when the new big bad comes around, the new sort of thing everyone's posting about, the next Twitter trend. It needs to survive this Twitter trend. And we need to continue talking about it and pushing our lawmakers about it until the generation that cares about it is the generation in power. And keep that in mind when you are the generation in power, instead of just being, the next Woodstock generation that became the baby boomers. That's not a direct answer to your question, but it's kind of the answer I wanted to give. So apologies for that.
No, it absolutely is. And I think it's now more than ever when, news cycles are minutes instead of, days or weeks anymore. It's so crucial to keep the fire, which is something I hear a lot from a lot of my professors and mentors who, were lucky enough to be inspired by, and now including the three of you. I'd love to just hear from Ashton if there are any sort of upcoming initiatives or partnerships that, inspire kind of a hope within your work, and anything that you're looking as well to address before we sort of wrap up with some direct calls to action.
Absolutely. Thank you. I'm really, again, appreciative of being able to be an organizer for the Sierra Club and be in the role at our environmental racism table, which is, again, with the Sierra Club, great organizations such as Action St. Louis, Arch City Defender, and Dutchtown South Community Corporation. And we work and partner with Washington University Interdisciplinary Environmental Law Clinic Center. That's a mouthful. I'm sorry, Tara. But working with these groups, we're really excited to keep this conversation going. So the organizers of this cohort have been coming together to have discussions for what's next, based off of the report and some of the really great work that the Law Clinic has been doing. We want to give possible policy solutions to the community members and have them communicate back to us what kind of work does the community want us organizations to prioritize and focus. We have resources, how can we share those and uplift the work and desire that's already being done in the communities, and that will really move towards transformative work. So we're hoping to talk more with community members, community partners about what should our priorities be as an environmental racism, quote unquote, table that we're organizing for. And like Tara mentioned, the air monitor issue in the city is egregious, and one of the issues that I'm hopefully will be looking more into at the Sierra Club, as air pollution is something we work a lot with. So I'm really excited for the future of that and how we can make changes there. But additionally, at the Sierra Club, we're excited to just keep working around these overarching issues that are impacting our city. And we specifically are looking at how we can hold our utilities accountable and other polluters accountable for what they're putting into our atmosphere and our environment. So a lot of the work that we do, it looks like suing utilities when they're breaking the laws that are set forth by the Clean Air Act, or engaging our Public Service Commission that oversees our investor-owned utilities to try to engage and make changes by law where we need to, and so that we can continue to hold these utilities accountable for what's being put into our environment. And then we also are working with local municipalities. I'm specifically working with folks in St. Louis County, as there's about 89 municipalities in just that county itself, and how we can start that conversation at a very local level around the climate crisis and environmental issues, and how we can have these conversations not only at a community level, but then bring it up to our next level of elected officials. So our mayors, our city council, and how we can make commitments towards rectifying some of these injustices, towards addressing the climate crisis, which is born out of environmental injustice and racism, basically. It's just more and more of this injustice over a long period of time that is polluting our environment to a state of almost non-repair, right? So how can we keep having these conversations about what's going on and making change at a local level is something that we're working toward. It is a step, a short-term goal towards an overarching long-term strategy of having so many people, elected officials, and power holders viewing the same wave of environmental justice, seeing the importance of addressing it. And then by using those relationships, we're able to kind of combat some of the things we're seeing at the state level when really bad legislation is coming out. I know that I have a connection with 10 mayors in St. Louis County who are against craziness going out of Jefferson City and can take action and submit testimony and do some really powerful work within their community. So there's a lot going on at many different levels for the Sierra Club, but we're excited to be in it, and we're excited to keep working with our community partners as we address this, because it's not just us, it's so many moving factors from so many different viewpoints to address this issue.
Absolutely. And I think something we always love to clarify for everyone watching is that we do, we record this discussion, we take notes of everything said by the panelists, we hold follow-up discussions about these issues in particular to sort of navigate through what was learned and direct our participants in areas that they can take effective action as well. So this ongoing discussion, there's so much information, and we just want to remind the audience that there is sort of, follow-up activities and discussions in place to ensure that this action is expanded upon beyond just tonight's discussion, which is, as Professor Roque pointed out, the whole purpose of it as well. In our last sort of 4 minutes, I'd love just to have each panelist sort of reiterate this call to action, we call it, as sort of the most important areas of involvement our audience can have in the issue in general. I know, Tara, you wanted to start with some sort of information about the clinic in particular.
Yes, so one very easy way that you can make an impact is our clinic is interdisciplinary, which means it's open to all students in the university, not just law students. We only take a small number of students because of the nature of our work. But each semester we take 10 students from 10 law students and 10 students from all throughout the school, from undergrad, graduate, medical school. I don't think we've had in PhD programs as well. And anyone who is interested in getting their hands dirty and actually doing the work while you're in school and getting credit for it, feel free to sign up for the clinic. We cannot take all students that apply, but we try to take as many as we can. And it really is an opportunity to work on issues of environmental law and environmental justice, make contacts in the public interest sphere, and find out what it would be like to pursue a career in public interest where you can really help people. May not be the most remunerative career out there, but it does really help you sleep well at night. So that's something easy you can do to help. And I don't really know when registration is, so I'm sorry I can't help you with that. But no, if you email me if you want to register, I can help you figure that out at a later date.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yes. Madeline, can you offer perhaps some initial steps people can take coming out of this discussion as well to stay involved?
Yeah, I can speak to where I was at when I was in undergrad. I'm assuming that most of the audience is undergrad students. And I went to the law school for environmental studies, nonprofit management, and GIS. And I thought, what skills do I have that could help a nonprofit already doing the great work? And for me, that was, I knew how to grant write and I knew how to do GIS mapping. So I found a nonprofit who, needed a grant writer, needed a GIS specialist, right? And I volunteered my services with them to make an instant impact. And I just want to echo, there are a lot of different places in the St. Louis area that you can volunteer at. Great Rivers Environmental Law Center, where I work, is one of them. We do law students and volunteers and also law students. But when you get there, make sure you have a skill that can add to the organization and you really put your passion into it, because public interest work is hard work. environmental racism work is particularly really hard issues to work on, right? And so if you're just kind of on the fence about it, if you're really not passionate about it, I think it's really going to be hard for you to make an impact, right? So I think first just really figure out what skill set you are good at. It could be event planning, it could be social media. There are a lot of different skills, especially that young people have, that people, I mean, I'm 26, I already feel like I don't know what trends are going on, like, right? And so I feel so dated. And so we need young people to come in and update us and help us and work with us. And it's just a really great experience that I did in undergrad. I really just think if you really want to make a difference, you can do it right now. You can do it safely in COVID. So just reach out. Like I said, always has opportunities for folks. And I know a lot of different orgs do as well. But really just find the org already doing the work and just partner with them to make the most impact, I think. And you do have power as young folks. You guys are the reason with the voter turnout and so many other issues and climate change issues really have showed up more than the older generation. So congrats to you all and just keep that same energy.
Perfect. And Ashton, any concluding thoughts for us tonight?
Absolutely. And I'm really appreciative of what Madeline just kind of wrapped up her portion with how much power this younger generation have. Like, I'm 24. I'm not like, I was just in college a few years ago, but the students and the youth, their engagement, their activism, their passion for addressing the injustices going on in our society is so there. And our power is in our voices, in our stories. So telling your story of why all of this impacts you, and maybe environmental racism indirectly, and maybe the effects of environmental racism that are still permeating, even though you may not be a person of color, a Black, Indigenous person of color. Your story is your strength. So share your story with others so they know what's going on, how it impacts you. Maybe they'll reflect on how it impacts them as well. But I additionally just want to say, yeah, continuing getting looped in with different opportunities that WashU has to get involved with the community. I think WashU does a really great job of providing instances and opportunities for students to learn and engage with different organizations and community partners throughout the St. Louis region. And so I would lean into that, the infrastructure you have at your disposal with being at such a great institution, and also really lean into opportunities where I think you can build and practice how to build just relationships with folks. How are you listening to your community members? How are you truly becoming involved with the community is very, very critical. And I think that's a great way for students to get more involved, is that one-on-one community interaction. And also, I just want to leave with saying that WashU can also lead by example. We can have some students start calling for disinvestment from coal or other fossil fuels in the institution, as I know that's happening at Mizzou, and I believe University of Missouri down at Springfield. A lot of different calls for disinvestment. Y'all can lead by example yourself if there's organizations for some reason are not aligned with you value-wise or topic-wise elsewhere, but you can also have that power within yourself. So please touch into that power and your humanity, because that's how we get stuff done when we don't have bajillions of dollars, right? But thank you.
I love that. Yeah, holding our institutions and ourselves accountable and ensuring that the passion for it is there to really engage with the issues needed and necessary. So, well, with that, I really wanted to thank our three panelists for joining us this evening. Such an amazing discussion, and we really appreciated all of your contributions, your time, and the insight you've given us all to continue this discussion as well. I think, as Annie mentioned in the chat, the follow-up discussion for this is next Tuesday, where we'll have had time to sort of digest and go through the information and organizations identified tonight to encourage our community to get more involved with and ensure that passion continues well beyond this evening's discussion. And thank you so much for the panelists for helping us do that. It's truly invaluable, and we're very grateful. So Thank you all so much. I know we're a little bit over time, but definitely check your emails for the follow-up information and have a great rest of your evenings. Thank you all for coming.